Good morning. So it was Lily Tomlin who said that the road to success is always under construction. And at Time in Real Simple, we wanted to understand better how women view their travels down that road and where they think they want it to take them. And so we did a big national survey. We oversampled women to try to understand this better, and I can't think of a better group of people to explore that with than Lori Goler, who's the vice president at Facebook, who oversees all of their talent in 30 countries, Susan Peters, the senior vice president of human resources at General Electric. For those of you counting, that means she's responsible for 320,000 employees around the world, and Kristen Van Ogtrop, the editor of Real Simple, with whom we partnered on this poll. And so, Kristen, I want to have you help us get our arms around what we discovered. And I think, in a way, the most striking thing was what we learned about the definition of success and how that changes. So can you talk a little about that?
So we polled 1,000 women nationwide and 300 men. And one striking thing was there were many differences between women in their 20s and women in their 60s and how they define success. Far fewer differences between the two genders, in fact. And what we found is over time, as women age, success becomes a lot less important to their lives, and they define it in ways that have a lot more to do with personal satisfaction, spirituality, friendships, family connections, and less about hard-driving career matters. So,
Susan and Lori, I'm wondering both if you see this in your teams, but also what the implications are, if there really is a shift during life stages, what the implications are for that in recruiting talent and retaining talent. Mm-hmm. Lori, do you want to take a stab?
Well, I'll start by saying something about just sort of the generation that's coming into the workforce now, known as millennials, and the differences between men and women, because I did think it was interesting that there were fewer differences between men and women than between women across the generations. And we are seeing that. The things that matter to the millennial generation are more similar across genders than different. So they really want to have a big impact personally on whatever it is that they're working on. So they want to know what they're doing matters. They want to be part of something bigger that has a positive impact in the world. And they share that. And they define sort of fulfillment that way. They also want to work on something where they get lost in the flow, something that they just love. They're just so engaged in it that they are lost in the flow there. So I think that's interesting. And then in terms of managing them and retaining them and recruiting them across the generations, I think it's not that different from what we've all always done, which is situational leadership. You need to have leaders who can lead and manage teams that are, of course, across different generations, all kinds of diversity. Generational diversity is not, of course, the only one. And who can think about opportunities for people and what matters to them in different stages. So
I would just piggyback on what Lori says around the whole idea of both the systemic and individual aspect of keeping people happy in the workplace, because that's really what is the retention factor. If people are engaged and happy, challenged, if they work with great colleagues, they'll stay. If some of those factors are missing, they'll go. So systemically, you have to have leadership training and opportunities, and we could go into those in great deals, but individually, you have to have dialogue, and I think that's perhaps the most challenging. You mentioned we have a lot of employees. We have 38,000 managers in GE, and so we need to make sure 38,000 people are doing a great job asking the people who work with them, how are you doing? What's important to you? How do you, what does happiness mean to you right now? And I know that sounds a little trite, but really understanding what is going on in that person's life, because as Kristen said, it's going to change at different stages of that person's life. And so this idea of having managers think more about the stay interview instead of the exit interview. I mean, we all have processes for the latter, but are we doing enough about the former? Meaning, what is it that my employees want to know and be, and how am I engaging with them? So I would just say that the way you kind of have to manage it is with the bigger, broader systemic stuff, but with really having great managers and coaches.
So I think that focus actually may help explain what was the single biggest difference between genders. It's true generally generation mattered much more than gender, but there was one place where there was a huge gender divide, and that was when we asked what personal qualities do you think contribute most to success? Kristen, what did we find?
Okay, so they, extremely important to the women in our poll was the link between success and being supportive in the workplace. And in fact, and so something like 69% of women said that's very important. Men, it was only 30-something%. And
So intelligence matters, hard work matters.
Yes.
But with men being innovative, being entrepreneurial, with women being supportive.
Yeah, and there was something, so I was in a breakout session yesterday, and I apologize if I don't remember your name, and you might not be here anymore, but the woman who's a professor at Berkeley Business School stood up and said that she was doing work on women admiration in the workplace, and they talked about, she asked her students, and they were millennials, women you admire, what 2 qualities do they possess? Number 1 was they pull other women up, and number 2 was they are nurturing. And then for men, 2 qualities you admire most. Number 1 was intelligence, and number 2 was being strategic. And that I feel like that's a huge, in thinking about how you grow your workforce, or grow them in their jobs, not grow them in number. How do you think about how women want to be managed versus how men want to be managed, and the relationships they want to have within the workplace, and how that makes them feel successful? Because the difference is really there.
I think you're right. It's obviously comes back to that sort of broader stuff that you do across an organization, and then the very individual stuff that happens in the manager-person relationship. And it varies. It'll vary by person, by gender, by where they are in the life. I have found that the things that are differentiators, the things that, people might desire certain things. They might say, I want to support or to be supported, to have mentors, or I want to be known as an intellect or strategic person. That really, in the end, what differentiates people and helps them get out of the pile, because in the end, leadership development is about trying to find those people at all layers of the organization that get out of the cohort that they're in, that stand above it somehow. And what are those factors that differentiate people? And I find them somewhat gender neutral. It's things like, well, certainly there are fundamentals. There's things like, intellectual capacity and business acumen and integrity, and those are sort of fundamental. But the differentiators we've found are things like communication skills and the ability to tell your very complex story, whatever you're working on, whether you're an engineer or a marketer or an accountant, in a way that captures your audience and gets people to understand and follow, and that's gender neutral. And that's kind of something that we want to impress with people, so that where we see that talent and capability, we can nurture and grow it. And it's kind of exciting that it's really more about the individual.
So Lori, I'm wondering whether, rather than being depressed by the idea that women leaders are supposed to be supportive and men are supposed to be strategic and intelligent, is there a case that in this whole conference is about connected leadership, in a connected economy, in an information economy, is it actually to a leader's advantage to have that nurturing, supportive, connective talent being a big part of their focus?
I wouldn't have guessed that supportive would have been on that list of things. I do think compassion is something that's important in leaders, and I think you find that in people who care a lot about the people around them. And I think that leaders who put other people first are, of course, people who do rise above the fray, as Susan described. And I do think those are often women who are thinking about the people around them. So I don't know that I would necessarily use the language supportive in sort of a more traditional way, but certainly in terms of just thinking about bringing other people along and making everyone around them better. I think there are women who are great at that. There are men who are great at that. But I do think those are the people who stand out in the workplace.
So Susan, you talked about the people who will rise above the cohort. So one of the things that surprised me most was when we asked people whether they wanted their boss's job.
Right, so I think this is actually kind of a huge challenge when you think about promoting people. So they don't. Basically, nobody wants your job. So you can be both disturbed and comforted by that. And with men and women, that was very similar. Almost 80% of both genders said, no, don't want it. a difference came in that half of the men would take it anyway if it were offered to them, and only a third of the women would. So how do you manage a workforce when there's so many people who, maybe not so secretly, don't want their boss's
So
job?
what do you do if people
get them
don't
to
want
rise?
to be promoted, don't
Well, I
want
think it's
what
a
do you do
different
with that?
question. Do you want to be promoted than do you want your boss's job? So, obviously in any of these surveys, that's a factor, how we
you
ask these
ask, right.
questions. But I think if you say, do you want to have greater responsibility, more challenge, new opportunities, stretch, almost everybody would say yes to that generic question. I think we often see our boss's job through perhaps a lens that isn't 100% an accurate view of the job. And frankly, it probably reflects on the boss and their ability to share the full boat perspective that they have. And we need better bosses. I think that's a given everywhere. But I really have not found that women aren't career aggressive. I have not found that in my personal career over many years. And I think there may be times where they dial it back, but for the most part, they always want to keep growing. And then frankly, when they have more flexibility with family situations, really want to dial it up. So in their, let's say, 40s or 50s, they really want to dial it up because they have more, they've got things under control at home.
So Lori, Facebook only has a 10-year timeline to
Yes.
judge this, but how have you seen this working at a place where people are moving around very quickly and the ambition level you would think would be much more intense?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we have a pretty high ambition level at GE. I think there's a pretty high ambition level too. So I was surprised by the data that people didn't want their bosses' jobs. In my experience, people seem to want their bosses' jobs. So I think it is, as Susan said, about learning and growing in your role or in the organization. I think it's great to have opportunities to move around an organization. I think when someone who has a lot of experience in one part of the organization moves to another, they bring a lot more depth and experience and texture to that role and the relationships that are so important across an organization for collaboration than someone new coming into the organization will bring, even if that new person has more specific experience in that particular role. So, I think you may or may not want your boss's job, but certainly I do see people who want to move around the organization and just want to continually grow and have roles that have larger impact.
Well, this is another place where I suspect certainly a national survey is going to show a lot of variance from the attitudes we might find in this room, of course, but one of the other ones that struck me was that the majority of women don't have a plan and don't care that they don't have a plan. Do you try to encourage a kind of strategic thinking in people, and how do you do that? Or do you think career improvisation is actually the way we're all going to be operating in this economy?
Well, just quickly, I think careers always look more elegant through the rearview mirror. This is it's not a very exact science, career planning. I think there's just too much luck, timing, circumstance, personal situation that plays into it. Having said that, I think helping people be prepared for opportunity to open more doors than they close in the choices that they make, encouraging people to get deep first so that they have a great foundation on which to trade as they begin to move up. I think those are all extremely helpful, gender neutral, actually.
I really agree with that. And I would say it's very hard in today's world to have a very long-term plan because the world changes so often and so frequently. I often will tell some of our interns or college students that we speak to that if I had had a long-term plan when I graduated from college, I would not be in this job because Mark Zuckerberg was 6 years old when I graduated from college. So, I think it is good to just sort of be a little more opportunistic and look for doors when they open.
That's right.
People have questions. We have a few minutes. I can't have trouble seeing.
We have one over here.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Susan, can I ask you a question? You talk about the amount of employees you have around the country and the need that folks have for real information, and we all need better managers. One of the greatest opportunities that I see managing, not the number of employees that you do, but across the country, is that they're not getting open and honest feedback from managers. And so as we're trying to nurture and develop people, generally, small problems become big problems, not because of the individual, but because of the leadership. And how have you faced that in your organization so that we don't lose people that really have great potential and career opportunities, but we just haven't given them the proper expectations and guidance?
I think feedback, and really it speaks to all the things we're talking about retention and everything, is critical. And we believe that early career development is particularly enabled by stretch opportunities, especially stretch experiences in which the person gets visibility, accountability, and feedback. So where we dig deep in those folks that come in from college, that cohort, they're on training programs, they get tons of feedback. What of course happens is they go into then that sort of black hole of mid-career where they're not getting quite as much. To that end, we're making massive changes in our performance development system that will be very technology enabled, and Lori and I have been sort of sharing ideas on this because it has to be, particularly for the millennials, has to be much more frequent than for the boomers that we're okay with once or twice or maybe 3 times a year. So the technology that we're working on will allow for constant feedback. And we've got 2 phrases that I think are interesting around feedback. That if you could get our managers, our coaches, to talk about, here's something I'd like you to continue to do, and here's something I'd like you to consider. Continue and consider. And we have found that managers are much better at giving feedback with that very simple tool because it doesn't feel quite as awkward, confrontational, tough, and it's real. It's so continue and consider.
And do people know, I love the way that sounds, but do they know consider means do something different?
Yes, and you have to be very, and I'd like you to consider, there was somebody who just asked me this, and I said, well, I'd like you to continue this, and I'd like you to consider not always looking at the boss when you're making that presentation, which is a very specific behavioral feedback. What you want your feedback to be is very behaviorally based, so that it's something you can do something about, right? I mean, this is the work we do, so.
One more question?
This one over there. Oh.
Yes.
So in terms of the feedback, do you see certain themes that come in place with men and women in terms of what are the areas that they want to consider? So I think there was a term yesterday, how many women have been considered aggressive? Do you generally get a sense of the feedback? Are men called aggressive, or is it just more predominantly women, and vice versa? What are men called that women don't generally seem to be addressed?
Lori, you want to?
Well, Sheryl Sandberg talked about this, and this is a big part of her, the research that she's done and the work that she's done, which is that, in her, this is why she came up with ban bossy as, a real thing in the world, because the women do get feedback about being aggressive, but it's very rare in an audience that men will tell you that they've received the feedback to not be quite as aggressive. And it all comes back to sort of what you expect culturally from people. You expect the men to be more aggressive. You don't expect the women to be as aggressive. So that plays into the feedback that men and women get. And one of the things that we've done at Facebook to try to address that is to talk about it. Mm-hmm. We talk about it in the organization and just raise awareness around the way that people are being perceived across the organization. And we've trained managers when they get feedback from people around the people who are working with them that they're being too aggressive to go and ask for examples. You said that this woman is aggressive in your feedback. That's what you wrote. Those are the words you used. Can you give me some examples? Interesting. Would you have used those same words if this were a man? And so just raising the awareness around it and talking about it, I think, actually has made a big difference.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you.
Hello again. Thank you so much, Nancy, Lori, Susan, and Kristen.